Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to be talking about why Rabbi Yirmiyah got kicked out of the Beit Midrash, Bava Batra 23a. It's interesting to note that Rabbi Yirmiyah shows up four times in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, asking questions that seem to get him into trouble. This is the only example where he actually gets kicked out of the Beit Midrash. But in other situations, Rabbi Zeira, his Rebbe, to whom he asks all these questions, says to him, hey, stick within the guidelines that you have. So I want to think a little bit about what Rabbi Yirmiyah's questions and the responses, the reactions that he gets to his questions tell us about Halakha and how it works. So let's start with our example from Bava Batra. So our example from Bava Batra was trying to figure out on Daf Kaf Gimel, Amud Aleph, trying to figure out how do we know who a fallen bird belongs to. So let's measure if it's within 50 amma, 50 cubits of a dovecote, we assume that it belongs to the owner of that dovecote. And Rabbi Yirmiyah asks a great question. He says, well, what if the foot of the bird is within 50 amot of one dovecote, but their other foot is outside of those 50 amot, meaning it is connected perhaps to a different dovecote. And he gets kicked out. So it's interesting. I want to start with just a few interpretations as to why he got kicked out. And then I want to look at some of his other examples of his Reviermia characterized questions, right? It's sort of he's a trope in the Bavli in a way. So let's start with two Rishonim, and then we're going to look at an Achron who's actually quoting someone from much earlier. But so Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom says, look, Valda Afak Hula Rabbi Yirmiyah mi Beit Midrash. This is why he was kicked out. Mishum dematrid lahu b'she'elo chain behen mamash. Because he's asking ridiculous questions. I mean, come on. We say it's 50 amot, and he's like, well, what if it's 1 foot and 50 amot of this and 1 foot and 50 amot of that? Okay, that's very nice for when you're like traveling from state to state and you're excited that two tires of the car, the front tires are in one state and the two back tires of the car in another state. But that's not the stuff of the Beit Midrash. I mean, he said 50 amot, 50 amot is 50 amot. Don't ask ridiculous questions. And one of the things we're actually going to see, if we get to it, is that there's a question in Nida that Rabbi Yirmiyah asks that really does appear, it's not even about measurements at all. It does appear to just be kind of a ridiculous question. So that's Rabbeinu Gershom. The Balei Tosfot, one of the answers that the Balei Tosfot offer, sort of the answer that I'm going to end up going with throughout this shir, which is, if you look at number 3 here, Tosfot and Bava Batra, Kaf Gimel Amud Aleph, Dibur Matchil V'Alda, V'nira LeRabbeinu Tam, seems to Rabbeinu Tam de Mishum Hachi Afku. This is why they kicked him out. Mishum de Midada, I think it's Midada is the way that you pronounce it, but I can't swear to it. Eino midada klal yoter mi-50 ama, because it's just no longer the rabbinic measurement if it's above 50 ama. Afilu raglo achat, even if it's 1 foot above 50 ama. Decho midot chachamim kenhu, meaning this is the way midot chachamim work, meaning the attempt, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this, the attempt to say, look, well, 50, why is 50 amot so sacrosanct? What if it's like a little bit more and a little bit? It's not that he's asking about some weird theoretical question. It's that he's basically questioning, can you come up with a measurement, or will the measurement always fail at weird exceptional cases, right? If it's a teeny bit more, a regel more than 50 amma, why should that make a difference than if it's within 50 amot, right? Like when you go down to the zoom in, what difference does 50 amot and a regel make versus 50 amot as a cutoff? And so in a certain sense, he's questioning, why is there a cutoff of 50 amot? He's kind of questioning the ability to ever use a measurement that's going to work, because again, it's possible that it would be like 50 plus 0.2. Why is that different, right? And they're basically saying, no, 50, that's it. But we'll get back to it in a little bit. My favorite, because, once you bring in people who are going to be Kabbalistic, you're going to get a totally different view. The Ben Yehoyada, also known to us as the Ben Ish Chai from the 19th century, Baghdad, in Iraq, Rav Yosef Chaim, he quotes Rav Chaim Vital, who's, of course, an important Kabbalist, says, Hine katav Rabbeinu Morenu Rav Chaim Vital Zal. So Rav Chaim Vital wrote to Rabbi Yirmiyah Tamida Yashoel Shelot Kemosha Amru Harbe Pamim by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah always used to ask questions, as you see many, many times. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked. And by the way, V'liyot kihunit kavein letova. He had good intentions in asking the questions. Lahagdil Torah ulahadir, to amplify the majesty of Torah, b'she'elotav, with his questions. Ubishu, and they embarrassed him. V'afku me'bei Midrash, and they kicked him out of the Beit Midrash. Lachain, therefore, you should know, says Rav Chaim Vital, yesh lo sachar tov l'mala. He has a great reward in heaven. Ki kol ha'she'elot ha'neshalot b'metivta d'rakia, all of the questions that get asked in the heavenly yeshiva, yeshiva shel mala, hu shoelotam, he gets to ask them. V'nishalot ha'yado, and they all get asked by him. But I love this is sort of like the Kabbalistic perspective of, wait a second, they kicked him out of the Beit Midrash. Who says they were right for kicking him out of the Beit Midrash, right? Or maybe like we've talked in the past about the difference between being chayiv b'dei shamayim and being chayiv b'dei adam, that maybe Beit Din Shel Mala in this situation can handle his questions, even if Beit Din Shel Mata can't handle his questions. But really, I'm going to go because I really want to get to a sort of an understanding of what's the halacha conversation that's going on here. What is the bother of what's bothering Rav Yirmiyah that he wants to say, what if it's 50.2, right? And what's bothering Rav Zeira and the establishment that they say, you got to get out of here. So for that, I want to look, so we're basically going to go with Tosfot, but we're going to amplify what Tosfot said. I want to look at first, sort of separately, another example of where this happens, okay? Where Rabbi Yirmiyah asks a question about a measurement, and to an extent, he's basically saying, what about if that measurement was missing a little, right? He's, in this case, with the Gozal, with the fledgling, he had said, what if it's 50 plus a foot? But in the case in Bavli Rosh Hashanah, Yud Bet Amud Bet, Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, it's actually, what if it's missing, 0.2 or whatever it is. So here's how it goes. And I'm not giving you the entire Gemara. I'm going to sort of cut to the chase in a way. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Asi says the name Rabbi Yochanan, Umatu Mishmei Rabbi Yossi Galili. Some people bring it in the name of Rabbi Yossi Galili. Amar Kra, the pasuk referring to the mitzvah of Hakel in the 8th year of the Shemitah cycle, where everybody comes on Sukkot to hear the Torah. Mitzvah of Hakel is described in Devarim, Perek Lamed Aleph, Devarim 31. There's a pasuk there, pasuk here, that describes it as follows: Miketz Sheva Shanim, after 7 years are over in the Shemitah cycle, meaning B'moed Shnata Shemitah, at the time of the Shemitah, which is already strange, Bechag HaSukkot, on Sukkot. Wait a second. Are we talking about the Sukkot? The 7 Shemitah years are over, the time of Shemitah on Sukkot. Why are we even mentioning Shemitah? It's not Shemitah anymore. It's Sukkot in the 8th year. So the Gemara says, Shnata Shemitah, my avidite b'chag HaSukkot. Why are we referring to this as Moed Shnata Shemitah? It's not Shemitah anymore. Shminiti, we're in the 8th year, and we're up to Sukkot at the beginning of the 8th year. Elolomar lach, what it's teaching you is called Tfua Shehivia Shlish B'Shvi Lifnei Rosh Hashanah. Any grain that reached a third, here's our measurement, that reached a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, which means that it would be able to be harvested on Sukkot of the 8th year. You treat it like a Shemitah growth, even in the 8th year, right? So all the things that you would do for something that grew in Shemitah, right? You're not going to harvest it. You're not going to sell it. You're not going to just throw it away, right? It should be wild. It should be collected, right? Meaning it should be treated. If it grew a third before the 8th year started, then it should be treated like a Shemitah product. Now, what does that have to do with Sukkot? The assumption is, and the Gemara goes on to describe this, the assumption is that if it's harvested on Sukkot, it grew at least a third before Rosh Hashanah. That's the measurement. The measurement is it's harvested on Sukkot. On the 8th year, we assume that it grew a third before Rosh Hashanah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah has a question. Amrli Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Zeira. Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Zeira, the kimlahu l'Rabbanan ben shlish l'pachot mishlish. The rabbis really know that it was a third that it grew and not like maybe a little bit less than a third that it grew. Like this, it must have grown a third by Rosh Hashanah if it's harvested on Sukkot. I didn't know it was a third and not, math people out there, give me something that's a little bit less than a third, right? How do you know there's a third and not like a teeny bit less than a third? Right? Again, he has this sort of like, how do you know that it's your measurement is right and you don't want to do like 0.2 less? Maybe it should be if it's grown, anywhere close to a third or something. Why a third? So Amar Lay, so Rabbi Zeira says to him, Lava milach heaven, I told you, lo tepik atzmecha, and I don't know, lo tafik atzmecha. My Aramaic grammar isn't great. Lo tafik nafshecha lebar mihilchata. Don't take yourself out of hilchata. Don't take yourself out of, some people explain this as sort of the traditional measurements. Some people explain this as sort of the practical decision that we've made. Don't take yourself out. Don't do this. Stop trying to get the exception, the 0.2 less or the 0.2 more. Kol midot chachamim kenu. This is midot chachamim. You have to come up with a measurement, right? Barba'im sa'ahu tovel. You do tevila in a mikvah. That's 40 sa'ah. Barba'im sa'ah chaser kortov. And if it's a teeny bit less than 40 sa'ah, you can't do tefillah and it doesn't count as a mikvah. Meaning it's not, is there such a big deal between 40 and a little less than 40? Does it look exactly the same? Sure, but we have to have a measurement, right? Same thing, kibetza mitami tumat ochlin. If you have a certain amount, it can transmit food impurity, right? A kibetza. But if it's kibetza chaser shum shum, but if it's a betza less a sesame seed, right? Very, very little. It doesn't, right? Meaning we have to come up with general measurements, standard measurements, even if you think there's no real difference. And maybe even in reality, there's like no real difference between, minus a sesame seed. But we have to have standards, right? And then it goes on to list another example. So this is great. So the Ritva says, first of all, the Ritva basically says, I explain the Gemara on the basis of the Ritva, where Rabbi Yirmiyah is like, do the rabbis know the difference between a third and less than a third? He's basically, the Ritva basically says, do the rabbis really know that a third is the exact amount that it grew? Do ilu have a pachot klal, that if it's a little bit less than a third, if it grew a little bit less than a third before Rosh Hashanah, in an exeret bechag, it wouldn't be able to be harvested on Sukkot. Like, is it really accurate that it has to be exactly a third, right? And then he says a little bit more, which I think in some ways is very similar to what we read in Tosfot in the name of Rabbeinu Tam. His kol shirei chachamim kachim. This is the way that shirei chachamim work. Perish, meaning, al kol panim, kol midot kachim, kol midot chachamim, kachim. All rabbinic measurements are going to be like this. You can't be so precise to try to figure out if, al shiur regarding measurement, that there's not, that it wouldn't work with a little less or a little more. If we tried to do this to be so precise, say, what if it's 0.2 less? What if it's 0.2 more? Maybe it should be a range of not 50 amot for that goes on. Maybe it should be 48.8 amot till 50.2 amot, right? Or for a mikvah, maybe it should be 40 sa'ah, anywhere from 39.8 sa'ah to 40.3 sa'ah. It's like, no, we're not going to do that, right? Well, actually, for the mikvah, it's only the minimum. So it would only be like 39.8 till 40. This is for different. Okay. Says if we try to do this, you won't be able to give any general measurement for anything. כי לעולם יהיה לאדם יכולת לדקדק ולומר בכל שיעור שאין מעלה או מוריד בו לפחות, או להוסיף. Honestly, like, what, להוסיף ממנו משהו, what's the big deal? You add a little, you take a little. Why are you even trying to figure out sort of a measurement, right? And so, in other words, the issue with Rabbi Yirmiyah's question is that Rabbi Yirmiyah is basically saying, I don't want you to have an established measurement, because really there should be like a range, because what's the big deal if it's a little bit less or if it's a little bit more in particular cases? And the response that comes to him is law doesn't work that way. You need to have general standards and measurements, right? Now, it could be that they're basically saying, well, look, these measurements are also Halakha Moshe Sinai. So like these are very serious. But I think there's also something else being said, which is, people talk about legal fictions, right? So legal fictions are often things like, oh, a corporation is treated as a person in law. But legal fictions can also refer to when you say, look, here's the rule. It's a third. If it's grown a third before Rosh Hashanah, it's cut at, it's harvested at Sukkot, and therefore retreated like a Shemitah object. Is it possible that it might have grown something that's grown a little less than a third before Rosh Hashanah can also be harvested on Sukkot? Sure. Is it possible that if it's harvested on Sukkot, it grew a little? Sure. But that's not for legal purposes. We actually need to be able to come up with some standards. So to an extent, this is sort of part of the formalism of the law, to be able to have a standard, even if in reality, the standard isn't always precise. And also, even if it seems like pikiyun, that if it was 0.1 more or if it was 0.1 less, it wouldn't be meeting the standard. Nonetheless, you have to have some sense of formal legal standards. And that's really the way that I read Rabbi Yirmiyah. What's interesting is that you actually have a few other places where Rabbi Yirmiyah asks Rabbi Zeira questions, where in one of them, at least, it's a little bit about the measurement, but there's also an element of almost Rabbi Yirmiyah is coming up with hypotheticals that break down the practical day to day, right? Like, and that I think is another aspect of this conversation, which is Chazal are very theoretical, meaning they're interested in, and what about this, and what about this, and what about that? But there are times where if you find something that practically works in 99% of the cases, the idea that you're trying to sort of upslug it, the idea that you're trying to sort of undermine it by finding like the one case, is a little bit off, right? It's a little bit off. So it's kind of being in this boundary between recognizing that the law is formal and that there are legal fictions, which means it's not really true in terms of the way it describes every single case, and being okay with landing that way. And also recognizing that even though what that says is there's a certain amount of sort of theoretical precision to the law rather than practical precision to the law, that sometimes if something works in 99% of the cases, stop trying to find the outlier, right? Law has to work in generalities, right? So that's what it has in common. Law has to work in generalities. Sometimes those generalities can be proven to not work in every specific case. And yet the generalities, they work in most cases. So leave them. So let's see. Bavli Sota, Tetzayin Amabet, Tana Rabbanan, Shloshat Tzrichin Sheyerau. There are three things that have to be seen in their in ritual life. And we'll see what we mean by this. It's very specific. Afar Sota, the dust of the Sota, right? The dust that's mixed in with water. You have to still be able to see the dust. The afer para, the ashes of the paraduma, even when they are mixed in with water, you still have to be able to see the ashes. Virok yevama, and a woman who's doing chalitza, you have to actually be able to see her spit. Okay. Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Amru, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, they said afdam tzipor. You know what else has to be seen? The blood of the bird that's used when a mitzorat or a mitzora goes through their tara process, right? Even though it's mixed with water, you have to be able to see the blood of the bird. Okay, so these things should be visible. And then the Gemara says, of course, my time of the Rabbi Yishmael. What's Rabbi Yishmael's reasoning? Why does it have to be visible? And it says, because it says it's supposed to be in dam and in mayim. So you have to be able to see the dam within the mayim, but there's still going to be mayim there. Fine. But the important that for our purposes, what happens is they figure out, okay, how much water can you put in? And the dam of the tzipor, the blood of the bird, is still going to be seen, right? So haketzad, I'm skipping a little bit. Mevi mayim shedam tzipor nikar behem. You have to bring the amount of water that a bird's blood will be able to still be seen in and recognized, meaning it won't, the mixture won't obfuscate your vision of the blood. The comment, how much is this? Revit, right? You don't want the blood to get totally mixed into the water. Good. So a revit, a quarter of a lug, no problem. So Rabbi Yirmiyah here's a measurement that works in most cases, meaning it seems like they sort of tried it, right? They basically said, okay, if you have the blood of a bird mixed with a quarter lug of water, you're still going to be able to see the blood. It works in 99% of the cases. And comes along Rabbi Yirmiyah and says, hey, what about 0.00001% of the cases? But I mean, Rabbi Yirmiyah asks Rabbi Zeira, well, Gedola, what if you have a big bird? And their blood, there's so much blood, it displaces the water. Or katana, let's say you have a bird that's so small, so it has so little blood, and the water totally displaces it, meaning the quarter lobe doesn't work, right? Because either it's too big, there's too much blood coming from the tzipor, and the water is no longer visible, or there's too little blood coming from the tzipor, so the water drowns it out. So Mao, what do you do? Rabbi Zeira says to him, Lava mina lo tapek. No, good. We have the nikudot. Lo tapek nafshach levar mi hilchata. Did I tell you not to take yourself out of hilchata? Right? So what does hilchata mean here? In the previous Gemara, I said maybe hilchata means tradition, meaning these are the traditions of our measurements, but maybe it means just practicality. Here it feels like practical halacha, meaning it's practical, it works. B'tzipor dror shiaru rabbanan. The rabbis measured this using a swallow. Okay, that's the bird we thought we were going to use. They measured it. It works. We're not, right? You don't have a large swallow that has so much blood that's going to be able to displace the water. And you don't have such a small swallow that's going to be able to be invisible within the water. So stop asking me these questions. So on the one hand, you might look at this and say, Rabbeinu Gershom's right. He's asking ridiculous questions. He knows that they based it on a particular bird, and that bird doesn't appear in these kinds of things. But I think there's also something else here, which is, wait, why are you coming to me with these weird outlier cases? Like, we're trying to establish the halakha, and you're like on the margin somewhere. Why on the margin somewhere, right? Like, there has to be some generality. I'm not saying, and this is what I think is so interesting. You know, my friend, Dr. Sarah Wolf, she wrote her dissertation on sort of the way that the rabbis ask questions and do theory and practice in the Gemara, because they're so theoretical, but at times they want to be very practical. And they ask questions where you're like, is that a real case? Is that something that really happened? Or are they just being like, theoretically, this could happen, right? And Rabbi Yirmiyah, she actually argues, she says, instead of looking at Rabbi Yirmiyah as he's the outlier, he's the strange one, it could be that the conversation with Rabbi Yirmiyah is somewhat emblematic of the conversation that Chazal are having with themselves, which is, we know we do a lot of theory, we know we do a lot of exceptional cases, but there has to be a limit, and there has to be something that covers 99% of the cases. It works, so just stick with it, right? So I think that's a very interesting suggestion on her part, that instead of just looking at this as a question of, do we accept legal fictions or not, which I think the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah sort of indicates that it doesn't necessarily describe every single case. Here, there's also an element of, when you do have something that describes a lot of cases, don't look necessarily for the outlier, right? These are sort of two sides of the same coin. The last example I want to give, I think, is a very intense example for anybody who has ever miscarried or experienced sort of this kind of loss. So I want to be very careful in how I give the example, because I think it's it is a little bit emblematic of how sometimes the conversations in Chazal are 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 theoretical. And I don't mean theoretical as in, can we come up with a crazy case? I think theoretical as in sometimes they're not experiencing some of the things they talk about themselves, right? And so I want to be very careful about this. This example is very different from the other examples that we saw. The Mishnah actually talks about a very strange case that if a woman, God forbid, miscarries and the fetus, excuse me, looks like the shape of an animal's fetus, right? It says hamapelet min behema chayav of. If somebody miscarries, if a woman miscarries a fetus that looks like a domesticated animal or a wild animal or a bird, right? The shape of it. Bain in bain tahorim, whether we're talking about kosher or not kosher animals, meaning whatever it looks like, right? What is this case even? I don't really know. Im zachar teshel zachar. If it's male, she should keep the rules of the dam yoledet, the blood of somebody who gives birth, the way you would keep it, the amount you would keep it for a zachar. Ve'im nekeva teshel nekeva. And it is, if it is female, she should keep the number of days that you would keep for a nekeva, right? It's a question of 7 and 33 for a boy, 14 and 66 for a girl, right? Ve'im ein yadua, and if she doesn't know, teshev lazachar ula nekeva, then she should sit for both. Divrei Rabbi Meir, meaning Rabbi Meir is essentially treating this fetus, even though it looks like a fetus. Again, I don't know the history of this. Did they think that certain fetuses actually looked like animals? Did they actually think that it might not be human? It's really not clear to me science wise, right? But Rabbi Meir certainly is treating this fetus like a human fetus, right? Meaning, even though it doesn't look like a human fetus. But the Chachamim say, Kol she'ein bo mitzurat adam ein ovlad. If it doesn't look like a human fetus, we are not going to treat it like a human fetus, and you're not going to follow the halachot of that. And so in the Gemara, Rabbi Yirmiyah is troubled by the fact, and this is where I want to be very careful, because I think it really speaks to, Rabbi Yirmiyah thinking like much more in a theoretical way than in a practical way. And it can be actually somewhat insensitive that Rabbi Zeira, Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Zeira, asks Rabbi Zeira, Rabbi Meir, for Rabbi Meir, who's treating this fetus that looks like an animal fetus, like a human, Da'amar behema me'e isha vlad ma'al yahu. It sounds like it's saying that an animal that's in a woman's fetus, that in a woman's womb, I don't know where that, I guess my oldest one is almost 10, so womb, okay, it didn't come so quickly, right? Who's in a woman's womb is considered a vlad, it is considered a human vlad. What about kibel ba aviha kiddushin? Ma. What if the father had already accepted kiddushin on behalf of this fetus, right? You see, it's like, what's going on here, right? What would be the halakha? Lamai nafkamina, what are you talking about? Like, what would be the nafkamina? What do you mean accepting for a fetus that was miscarried? What would that be, right? Li'itsure ba'achota. The issue would be to, 1 second, let me just pause. I have to just pause this 1 second. Sorry about that. Let me go back to the share screen. So what does Rabbi Yirmiyah's question even mean? It means, what he means is, what would happen if somebody accepted kiddushin on behalf of this fetus, this sadly miscarried fetus? That means that this unborn child, their sister, would become asura to that person. And the Gemara says, what do you mean? A sister of someone is only asura if the person is alive. Lamemra dechaye, are you saying this fetus is going to live? This was a miscarriage. That doesn't make any sense. Rav Yehuda Amarav, lo Amar Rabbi Meir, Elaho Alubamino Mitkayim. Nobody thinks this fetus is going to live. It's a miscarriage, right? It's the reason why you sit dam yoledet for it is because it's something that, its type would live, right? Meaning it wouldn't live, but an animal that looked like that would live. So Amar of Achabar Yaakov, Rav Achabar Yaakov says, Ad kan hevio Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zeira lidei gichuch v'lo gachich, that Rabbi Yirmiyah was trying to make some sort of joke, and Rabbi Zeira didn't laugh, right? That I think is very interesting. And with this, I'm going to end. That I think is very interesting because it sounds like Rabbi Yirmiyah was trying to make, at least this is the way that, uh, you know, Rav Achabar Yaakov is explaining it. Rabbi Yirmiyah was trying to make a joke. Now, is the joke a problem because you're talking about miscarriage and you should make a joke? Is the joke a problem because nobody thinks Rabbi Meir really thinks that this would be a viable fetus? Like, what? It's sort of like you get back to Rabbi Gershom and you're a little bit like, wait, Rabbi Yirmiyah, you're not in our dialogue, you're not in our discourse. So here's how I would summarize this. And I actually put in Dr. Sarah Wolf some of the stuff that she's written because it's a really good summary if you look at the sources. Here's where I would put us. I think Rabbi Yirmiyah sensitizes us. Rabbi Yirmiyah's questions and the way they're responded to sensitize us to a few different things. One is the first thing that we talked about, Rabbeinu Gershom, that it is possible that you could be in a conversation where you get so caught up in your own excitement about the theoretical aspects of the conversation that you start asking questions that actually are very disconnected from the practical life that halakha is supposed to be guiding, right? It's like it's now become a game. It's become a theoretical game instead of really thinking about, like, what are we talking about? And I think the example of miscarriage is actually perhaps the best example of it, where you're talking about something incredibly serious. And then this strange question comes out of nowhere, and it's a little bit like, wait, what are we talking about anymore? Right? Like we've gone so far from the practical of what matters, right? That's one. A second is, I think, what the Balei Tosfot and the Ritva were trying to tell us, which is, yes, it's true. You're going to have certain legal fictions. You're going to have certain rules that may not be true in every single case, but as generalities, they work. And that's partially because we can't actually be so precise. It's partially because in order to be practical, you need generalities, right? Like that's what law does. It offers you transparent generalities. And the last thing I would say is I really love Dr. Wolf's insight that for Rabbi Yirmiyah, it may not just be about Rabbi Yirmiyah. It may be about Chazal trying to establish these kinds of boundaries. And even in their own work, where they're going to be asking about exceptions, they're going to be asking about theoretical cases, and they're going to be recognizing that not everything is going to be exactly perfect and perfectly line up with a description of how reality is. And to essentially say, yeah, but that's a decision that we've made because that's what we think halakha should consist of. So I hope this has been good food for thought. Thanks everyone for joining me. Speak to you next week.